Wait, bhai, good evening. What's up?
Hey, hi, how you doing, mother? All good?
All good, all good.
A lot of kids come up to me and talk to me about, when they're taking up new jobs or when they're changing jobs, and they kind of ask you questions like, they get good offers from startups. So what kind of, role should you take? What kind of organization should you join? So I think what we're going to talk about today is what it is like working for a startup. I've been a startup specialist for a while now. In fact, like my last two stints are with startups. I've been in advisory capacities of startups before. So that's the topic for the day. Should we or should we not work for startups?
The word startup is a little too broad, in at least to my understanding. So when you say don't work in a startup, are you talking about a bootstrap startup or a startup that is funded? And could you please explain the differences between the two?
Startups is a very wide spectrum, right? So some companies stay in startup mode for a very long time. Some have just kind of initiated. Bootstrap startup, what is the definition of a bootstrap? A bootstrap startup is basically where the founders don't really have too much cash to spend. So they will try to get jobs done from various people that they know, and promise them that as and when the startup gets funded, the people who've been involved will be fairly compensated. There's different rounds of funding, talked about it the last time. So there's the angel round of funding, there's the seed funding, there's the series A, there's the series B, there's a whole bunch of funding rounds that happen, and there are different players involved who kind of fund startups. So there are angel investors, there are all kinds of investors. They're at early stage startups, so some of them will fund early stage startups, some will fund startups that are established, some will fund startups that are at an inflection point and do need a lot of money to take that quantum leap into kind of becoming very successful. So the game involves two people. One is the startup founders themselves, and then there's the investors as well. So I'll make a very bold statement or a very bold statement to start, and I'll say don't work for a startup unless, and there's a whole bunch of things that go under that unless. I'm not saying that working for startups is bad, but you need to keep your eyes open and understand exactly what you're getting. So when I say don't work for startups, that's what I mean.
It's honestly a little contradictory. You call yourself a startup specialist. You're working in a startup currently, and then you say this. Would you want to give a brief intro on what you do in your startup?
So I am the chief operating officer of Singapore-based fintech, and I've been with them for over 6 years. It's been a phenomenal experience, and I think at some point we can talk about my experience with startups, which brings me to these conclusions or gives me the right to kind of make these recommendations, or gives me the wherewithal to advise people as to what they should be looking for, what they should be doing if at all they do go and look for a startup. Before that, also, I was in a startup. It was with them for like 7 years before, in fact, I bailed. And I bailed because it went south, and I wrote away and I lost a lot of money through the 7 years that I was there. It actually did set me back considerably.
So you've had 13 years of experience, and you are saying don't work in a startup. That says a lot about.
Yeah, so as you said, it's contradictory, but it's not contradictory. All I'm doing is, putting out a word of caution, saying if you're going to be working for a startup, what are the factors that you should be keeping in mind? Because working for a startup is no joke. The work hours will be long. You will always be kind of understaffed. The pressures will be a lot. The pressures to sell are very acute. The pressures to deliver are acute. It's all about cash flows, bringing in cash at a particular point in time. So that's the reason why I say that you need to be extremely wary and careful when you select a startup. So what are the things that you need to see? I think you need to see the promoter's background. Is this like a first generation entrepreneur? Is the first startup they've ever done? What kind of experience do they have? Anybody can have a bright idea and get it funded, but to actually run the company is a very different cup of tea. So you want to make sure that these guys know what they're talking about, because you've just finished off school or college or done whatever course that you've done, and you now are going to work for a startup. You really don't have any financial backup or financial strength or any money stashed away. The reason why you're going to work is because you're going to try and make money. Startups, the early days are very difficult. The deal values will not be as big as they should be. There'll always be pressure on sales. There'll be always pressure on the top line and the bottom line as well. So whereas the top line may be healthy, you also need to see what the bottom line is. Are they really making a profit or not? Because burning cash is very easy. Controlling that cash burn is something which is not as easy as people think. So that's the reason why the operating side is extremely important. So the factors that you would keep in mind would be that do you have a family background that's going to sustain you if things go south? Do you have the tenacity? Do you have the wherewithal to kind of withstand the pressures? Are you willing to work hours that can be fairly strenuous? It's literally 24/7. Your responsiveness has to be extremely good. Every startup, when it gets into a deal, every deal is a make or a break situation for them. There are very few startups that actually have funding that is going to last them. They call it the runway, right? Kind of, there's a runway and the run rate. So the run rate basically says at what level are you bringing in cash and how much cash are you burning. Initially, it's understood that you're going to be burning cash. But if no money comes in, how long do you have cash in the bank to actually keep running your operations for a period of time? Typically, startups don't have more than a 3-month runway. And if you have 6 months or a year, that's really fantastic. Okay. But what you will learn working in a startup, you probably won't learn anywhere else, because startups tend not to be siloed. Everybody literally knows what the other person is doing. Everybody understands that they've got to carry their own weight. Everybody pitches in and helps each other out. A sharing of knowledge is very good in a startup environment. But you need to be a self-learner. You need to kind of teach yourself. You need to understand, because you probably may not have training plans. You may not have training curriculums. You may not have any formal training, but the on-the-job training that you get in a startup, you probably won't get anywhere else. So huge tick in the box in terms of the experience that you'll gain, keeping in mind that, there are other sides to it that you need to keep in mind. It all depends at what stage of your life in. What is your financial condition? Are you the only breadwinner in the family? Is your family depending on your income? There are so many things that you really need to keep in mind. And then, of course, what is your role in the startup? I mean, if you're just another cog in the wheel, which is very easily replaceable, then you might as well do that somewhere else. Unless you believe that by joining the startup, you will be given a role which kind of equips you for the future, which kind of builds your profile up for the future, then you should take it up, because getting that kind of a role and getting that kind of an exposure, you will not get in a big corporate. It will take you years before you get that exposure, because there's so many other people more senior than you that they will employ. Remember, the startups don't have much money to throw around. So it's very unlikely that they're going to hire heavy hitters. They're going to hire people who have just started off in their careers. They'll have very good caliber. They probably have very good skills, but they won't be heavy hitters. They won't have too much experience sitting behind them. So these are the things that you need to consider when you go and work for a startup.
You just mentioned the amount of teaching that a startup can do in a short period of time. It'll take you years in a corporate. So do you want to maybe put a number on that and mention how many years you'll have to spend in a corporate to learn the same experience that you do in a startup?
It's difficult to quantify. And I think it's hands down that the time that you will take to learn and gain experience in a startup will be a lot less than what you'd gain in a corporate. And going back for a moment to the earlier point where I talked about, levels of exposure. The other huge advantage of working in a startup is typically they are much smaller organizations. So you will have exposure to the CXO level very easily. I think it'll be very easy to access the CXOs and tell them what you're up to, what you're doing. So you're going to be noticed. Whereas in a corporate, you probably will get lost in the ocean. You won't be noticed unless your boss he's the kind of person who will promote you. He's the kind of person who will project you. He's the kind of person who will give you a lot of credit. But that's not really very, very common, because there's so many people working there. So nobody's going to kind of notice you. You're a cog in the wheel, as I've said this earlier. But in a startup, it's very different. You can get noticed very quickly for both two reasons. Either you get noticed for something that you've done brilliantly, or then you get noticed for screwing up, because that also puts a lot of scrutiny on you. So this is the big advantage of working for a startup. To quantify years of experience, I'd say 2 years of experience in a startup probably gives you 5 to 7 years of experience that you're going to get in a corporate. And then if we try to go and trade that off and we try to go and say that what is it that we should be doing. So I think the advice would be here is that go and work for a startup in the early days for very quick acceleration in your learning, which is something you'll be able to capitalize when you go and work for a corporate later. Do understand that in the early days, the startups will probably pay you a lot less than the corporates would pay you. So that's another factor that you will want to kind of keep in mind. But mind you, once you've switched and once you're technical, so you would set yourself back temporarily only to build yourself up in such a way that you'll accelerate that pace of making up what you've lost very quickly so you've got to play the long game, in other words.
So how do you think the working culture of a startup differs from a corporate? Like you just talked about in a corporate, just a cog in a wheel. How else does the working culture difference?
That's a wide sweeping question. So, and I think one size doesn't fit all. So the working culture in a startup depends on a very small group of people. And the working culture is actually driven by the promoters. Whereas in the corporate, the chances are the working culture is driven by very robust HR practices. It's driven by very seasoned professionals. There's very little trial and error, but you still can't take away the fact that you are going to be a cog in the wheel. But your appraisal processes and so on and so forth will be a lot more streamlined. They'll be a lot more scientific. It won't be a figment of somebody's imagination or just a gut feel, oh, he's done well, let me give him X space. Or he's not done well, he doesn't deserve a promotion. So that will probably happen more in a startup than it will happen in a corporate. So there's trade-off. There's a plus and a minus, and there's a balance in kind of both environments that you would kind of work in. I would again advocate, if you're somebody who's willing to take risks, if you're somebody who's very adaptable, if you can adjust easily, you can blend in easily, you can adopt the culture of the organization, then probably startups is not a bad idea. But if you're very regimented and you're very rigid and you want systems and processes in place and you need your marching orders to do anything, you're not really a self-starter, then the corporate is probably a better bet for you. That is my take on. Now, coming back again to the specific culture, a lot of the startup culture evolves due to the success of the startup. It also evolves due to the kind of funding the startup eventually gets. Everybody wants to have a great culture, a great place to work, but those are certain luxuries, if I may say so, that the promoters may or may not have. I might want to put in a training plan in place. I might want to go and send my guys for the best possible training, but I may not be able to afford. Whereas in a corporate, you would actually go through it because they want to make sure that the employees kind of, go through the right kind of training. And the culture will be driven by the people who started it off. Also, to get along with people, you need to understand what their DNA is like, what drives them, what makes them tick. So these are all the factors that you're going to have to keep in mind when you choose to go and work for a startup. And I might also add, what is the attraction? Why do people want to go and work for startups? I think it's because in my understanding, and I believe that people want to go and work for startups simply because they think the startup is going to get some obscene amount of funding. They're going to be bought out. There's going to be a merger. There's going to be an acquisition, and overnight you're going to become a millionaire. If you really go and do the statistics, how many startups actually even get to the second round of funding? Very few. The startups that do get to the second round of funding, how many of them actually get bought out at very fancy valuations? Very few. And in the climate that exists today, where the entire investing community, whether it's the VCs, whether it's the private equity firms, they've become a lot more discerning. So they're not just throwing money at the startups as they used to before. They're very calculative about at what stage they're going to put in the money, what are the expectations, what are the returns they're going to get. It's not as easy as it used to be. So if your belief is that you're going to make millions of dollars or millions of rupees overnight, the probability of that is very low. It's not something that you should bank on. So the better thing for you to bank on is to learn the ropes, to understand what it takes, to get skills that you would not acquire anywhere else, to do a lot of self-learning, to contribute in every possible way, to contribute to the founder's vision of where they want to kind of take the company. So these are the things that you would want to do if you do decide to go and work for a startup.
I want to know the difference between working for a startup and starting your own startup. Which is probably more feasible, and when should you do what at which stage of your life?
Startups are all about ideas, right? I have a great idea. I'm very passionate about it. I do believe it's a great business opportunity, and I want to bring that baby to life. How do I go about it? I do a startup. I bootstrap initially. I, put my wireframes down. I, bounce ideas around, understand what this product is all about. But keep in mind that, people see things like, popular shows where, the startup founders will go before a committee or a panel. And I'm not taking names of shows, but there are so many shows in India and overseas as well, where they will go and present their case, and there will be a panel of luminaries and investors who will suddenly throw money at them, and these guys become very popular and the startup is up and running. There's more to it than meets the eye than that. First of all, how many people who have ideas actually go and manage to go and get funded? There are a million ideas that fall by the wayside as opposed to the ideas that actually do get funded. And finally, why will somebody fund you? They'll fund you only if your idea is got commercial viability. Nobody is in the business of throwing their money away. Everyone wants a return on their investment. You go to a bank and take a loan, the return on investment is, let's say, the rate of interest. You go to get a working capital loan, they'll give you money to run your company so that the bank can get paid back. The venture capitalists are no different. Their time horizon and the way they take a view of that investment is different from the way traditional banks or financiers take a look at it. But typically, it's all about returns. The VCs and the PEs, they look at the returns. Typically, if there's an exit or there is a sale of the company or there is a merger or there's an acquisition or there's an IP, finally, they exit only when somebody else comes in. Otherwise, they are tied into that investment for a long period of time, right? So at what stage, coming directly to your point, I mean, at what stage of your life do you actually go and do a startup? Do it as early as possible, because that's the time you have on your hands to actually take the risks that you can take. That's also a great time for learning, because you are young, you are agile, you're adaptable, you're open to ideas, you're aware of what's going on in the world. So I think the probability of you being successful as an entrepreneur ab initio are higher when you're a lot younger. There are a lot of stories of people doing it even when they're in school and college and when they've just exited, and there's stories of people who become entrepreneurs much later in life. There's no one thumb rule. It all depends on how it's going to kind of fly. Also look at what your target market is, right? So if it's an easily saleable commodity, then your probability of being successful is higher. If it's going to be a harder sell, then it's probably going to be a longer run. And you also need to know yourself very, very well, where you need to know whether you're going to be able to take the pressures of actually starting up. Because what will happen is you're willing to risk things yourself. But the one that will really get to you is when you hire people and end up not being able to fulfill their dreams and hopes, in terms of not paying them adequately, not the company running into trouble and so on and so forth. That's going to be very difficult for you as a promoter to digest unless you're very thick-skinned. These are the things that you need to keep in mind. Finally, it's any money you put in is what we call risk capital, right? It's how much money that you're willing to put at risk. And of course, risk is directly associated to a reward. And you need to kind of be able to understand that what is the time frame you're willing to give for this idea to come to fruition.
Notion around working in a corporate job. You had talked about how a corporate job has systems in place, and if you're that type of person, you should go towards a corporate job. That is not what the internet says. They say that a corporate job sucks out your life, takes away all your time, you have nothing to do. Would you like to clear that out? Is that how you think it is?
On that, I think it's hyped up. And I think one thing I will say, and that I've always experienced, the grass is always greener on the other side of the fence, right? So when I worked for a corporate, it was long hours, very challenging. I loved it. I mean, I can't say that I thought of myself a corporate slave and so on and so forth. The hours were long, very challenging, but there are different dimensions. Startup also, it's going to be long hours. So whether you're a startup slave or a corporate slave, you're going to be a slave somewhere or the other. All right. But the satisfaction that you're going to get probably in a startup environment will be probably higher than what you'd get in a corporate, just because of the exposure and the experience that you can learn. A lot of this has to do with your personal nature, right? So if you're somebody who's affable and you can get along with your colleagues, then they're going to teach you. If you're going to be standoffish and if you're going to kind of think you know everything, or you're not willing to learn, or you're not willing to contribute, then it's going to be difficult. Whether you're in a startup or whether you're in a corporate. I think it's very hyped up what they say about startups being great and the corporates being very difficult to kind of work in, and it's a miserable life. I don't think that's necessarily true. I think that's a lot of hype and that's a lot of emotion that goes into it. I think the autonomy that you get in a startup is probably what is very attractive. I think that is what brings people to think that startups are really cool to work in. It's a very young vibe. The culture is very vibrant. Everyone is at a stage in their life where they're very keen and eager to learn. That is something that probably is definitely much better in a startup than you would get elsewhere. Everyone's a family. And I'll share my personally. Wherever I've worked in a startup, especially the one I'm working in now, I've never ever had to tell anybody that something needed to be done by a certain date. They just understood. I don't need to stay back and ensure that things have been done or not done. They're just going to get it done. The level of responsibility that I have seen, at least in the company that I work in, is huge. I know I joined, 6, 7 years back when I joined, I did a 4-day stint before I went and met the board of directors and, the investors. Actually, remember I did a presentation, 4 days, and these are my observations. And this was the first thing I put. I've never seen a crew that is so dedicated. They work in pin drop silence. They don't take these chai breaks and coffee breaks and cigarette breaks and this and that. They just get their heads down and work. They don't work, get up and go away for lunch at 1 o'clock. It's flexible. I mean, they'll go to work, they'll go for lunch at 3 o'clock if they've got work to do. If there's a customer call, they'll not reschedule the call or they won't just show up. So I think in that respect, I think that's a very refreshing thing to see. And I think people who work in startups like that as well. The degree of flexibility you get is much higher. So that is something that definitely would weigh in the balance and say that, okay, give a tick in the box saying startups are probably better.
Having talked about all these topics, I want to get an idea about the current startup ecosystem. Is it still like before? Is it still a race who can lose money the fastest?
No. I don't know whether you read, Manav. I wrote a series of articles on startups, right? And one of the things I always said in those articles is what drives these investors to sink in such obscene amounts of money on plays that they know is not going to make money for a very long time. I never was able to get an answer for it. And I thought that I'm really stupid. Maybe I'm just not getting it. But I was very heartened when there's a lot of very senior people and well-known international investors who kind of see it the same way. And they said, yeah, it doesn't really make sense to throw that kind of money. But of course, there are other plays involved. So to bite the bullet, the startup ecosystem has changed. It's no longer the same where you will see. Of course, you will still hear of huge deals. You will hear of the unicorns. But I'll ask you a question. So what is it? By definition, what is a unicorn? Where the valuation is XXX times the initial play, correct? So my question to you is, can you name one unicorn that actually made money for its investors? Did they actually turn a profit? They may have got market share. They may have got points of presence. They may have got all of those things, but are they actually profitable? Nothing comes to my mind. So which unicorn has actually made a profit? I'm talking about bottom line profit, where they've got this unicorn status and everyone ga crazy. And I don't recall a single one saying that, hey, listen, you know what, I'm net profit. Even if they are cash flow positive, I would still say that, okay, these guys have achieved. If they are EBITDA positive, I'd still say that they've achieved something. But I don't know of any. And if I'm wrong, I'll very happily be corrected. So the ecosystem is different. Today, investors are looking at companies that are going to turn a profit. They are on the cusp of turning a profit, and they're very wary. A lot of international funds are shying away, getting out of the ecosystem here in India. So a lot of the investing is happening through local plays, family offices, very high net worth individuals, and the big international investors, some of them are actually disappearing off the radar, or they're reducing their commitment levels over here.
All right. So, Bhai, I want something on the startup scene of India. How is the Indian youth or the Indian population approaching entrepreneurship?
I think the great thing about startups and startups becoming popular as a concept is that it's encouraging people to think beyond horizons or their known boundaries, to think out of the box, to take that risk, to take the plunge. I'll give an example. Way back in the day, that the streets of London are paved with gold. Similarly, if you take a place like Bombay, there's people who flock to Bombay, flock to Bangalore, flock to Chennai from small towns, small villages, in the hope and aspiration that they're going to suddenly make it very big, right? What's happened now is that people can be in smaller towns and still have those hopes and aspirations and dreams by thinking that they can set up their own businesses. So the success stories are actually helping people dream and go and chase their dreams because they know that there is something that they can do. There are opportunities available. So there are so many startup kind of bodies like, TIE and, the Griffin Works Foundation. There's quite a few of them that actually help these startups who actually have these hackathons, and they do these programs and all the startups will come and do their pitch decks. And if somebody likes their pitch, then they will get funded. Even if it's $10,000, $50,000, it's okay, but it's the next step. It's being recognized. And what that also does is that these startup promoters understand what it is to present their idea to somebody else. It's very easy to have an idea and love it so much that you will defend it to kingdom come. But when you're faced with a hardcore investor, he's going to ask you questions that you may not be ready to give answers for. So when you start doing these small pitches here and there, every time you pitch to somebody, what you realize is that that investor has got a different mindset. mindset. He's looking for something different. So you've got to literally tailor your presentation to what that investor wants to see. What is his investment objective? What is his investment philosophy? What is he looking for? What is the kind of promoter that he's looking for? Who is he willing to back? So I think the whole game has changed, and it's become very encouraging for smaller people or for people who come from very average, mediocre backgrounds to actually take a punt and become big industrialists. Earlier, you could be an industrialist or you could be an entrepreneur only if your family was in business. It's very rare back in the day when you and me and everybody else could also have access to funds and become an entrepreneur. You went to traditional banks, they would ask for collateral security, they would ask for this, they tie your hands and legs and say, okay, now go and swim. That's no longer the case. So I think in that respect, this whole startup game has enthused and made people really imagine, try to reach the stars. I think that's a very huge positive thing, outcome of this whole startup game, if you ask me.
Okay, so Sumir bhai, a few minutes back you were talking about these TV shows that promote entrepreneurship, and you did not seem like a big fan of them. May I ask why?
This is my personal opinion. And my personal opinion is that this is all for TRPs and for viewership and so on and so forth. And just a few days ago, there was an article on LinkedIn or a post on LinkedIn that talked about one of these popular shows having committed funds to who were the winners and then not shelling out those funds for a very long time. And the reason that was cited, I don't know how much of it is true, but it seems very logical. And a lot of people who are in the know have lent weight behind that trend of thought that's emerging, saying that, yeah, they want to invest, but they're looking more at viewership and they are looking more at, how the public is going to see. So a lot of it is to do with popularizing the show. That said, it gives viewership and it gives people hope. So it's not all bad. It's just that if this kind of thing is going on where people are going to these shows and are not being given what they are promised, and that's so. To sum up, the whole startup game has revolutionized how people look at doing business, the avenues of capital available to them. It's enabled people to dream very, very large. Whether you go and work for a startup or whether you go and want to set up a startup, I think it's changed things very dramatically. I mean, there are now avenues available to entrepreneurs and job seekers that were not there before. The number of startups are huge, and I think there's an article again the other day that talked about the maximum number of startups in Maharashtra. Second comes Karnataka. Third is either Telangana, AP, or Chennai. I'm not sure. The startups have also emerged as a very big employer base. So they are giving a lot of employment. They are generating revenue and generating employment for a lot of people. So that's all the positive side of it. There's a lot of new wealth creation happening. It's no longer the traditional wealth creation model. It's literally writing a piece of paper as a term sheet and then, being able to go and sell that at a much higher valuation at a later date. So your acceleration of wealth is much higher. It's no longer the traditional wealth creation. Every 7 years, your money will double if you put it in a bank deposit. You can double your money fairly quickly. And then if the startups and we go to IPO, then there's a lot more people that get involved. The downside, as I said, is, well, not downside. I mean, what you need to keep in mind is that for every startup that succeeds, there are probably 100 startups that fail. And if you are a job seeker and you're going to work in a startup, you need to keep your eyes open as to what kind of startup you're going to work in. Ask for financials, do your due diligence, find out what other existing employees think about the startups, find out about the promoters. And if you want to be an entrepreneur yourself, then keep in mind that yes, no matter how good your idea is, it needs to be a saleable commodity. Gone are the days where you'll be able to just sell a pitch based on an idea and only on an idea. Today, your idea needs to be backed with a material, tangible turning of profit to become profitable as quickly as possible. So if you're able to wrangle that, then by all means, you should become a startup entrepreneur.